On the screen we have one of the great men of Colorado, perhaps the greatest man in Colorado, a gentleman by the name of Douglas Bruce, who's the author of, and the mover and shaker behind, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. For that he has been roundly criticized, reviled, and a little bit later, during the question and answer session, we will be possibly asking him about the political consequences and the personal consequences of his patriotic stance on taxes. Douglas?
P-R-I-S-O-N.
Okay. For those who don't know how to spell, this gentleman spent 6 months in prison, is that correct?
And 3.5 months in county jail.
So, with great, it is my great honor to present both my friend and a political ally and a wonderful man, Douglas Bruce. Douglas, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ralph. I want to begin by telling the group assembled there how lucky you are to have Ralph as your leader. I'm not trying to suck up or anything, but I pointed out to him over an hour ago that the system that we had rehearsed wasn't working this morning. And he was on the phone constantly and on his computer, and he finally got it to work. So we've been preparing for this. He's been asking me to speak for many months, and we prepared for this Skype presentation for over a week. And it was a last-minute snarl, and it's now been corrected. So you're lucky to have Ralph as your leader. So if you have a recall petition, I will not sign it. Now, before, I'm not going to dwell on, although I'm happy to take questions on the political repercussions that he alluded to for standing up for your beliefs. We're all told to stand up for our beliefs, but the government's message is, if you really stand up for your beliefs and your beliefs are ones that we don't like, we're going to get you. And they did. And that's not what I'm going to dwell on, but it really did happen. I think Ralph sent out an email, but if you didn't save it, the story of an abbreviated story of my political woes is at douglasbruce.com. On the main menu, it says Denver tax case. Until yesterday, the latest entry was my 10th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals habeas corpus appeal, which I've tried to write in a way that was not only legally sufficient, but clear to the average person. And just yesterday, I filed a supplement to that because of a development on Monday. In case you've heard of Cliven Bundy,
yeah,
he was the rancher that had a protest and a standoff with the officers of the Bureau of Land Management, federal government, and his case was just dismissed.
Yay.
With prejudice, meaning they cannot retry him again. And it was because in his case it only had to do with one government abuse at trial, which was discovery. Discovery is a process by which the government is required to tell the defendant what the charges are and produce all the evidence that they have and all the evidence that they are requested to produce that's relevant in the criminal case that's being charged. Well, they had what I consider relatively minor discovery violations. I mean, it was enough to shock the judge because it had to do not with his guilt or innocence, but with the information about the staffing and positions and cameras and so on of the government. The information that they did not furnish in the case was dismissed with prejudice, which got national attention. And So I seized upon that to point out that my case was many times more severe than that, and had not only what I itemized as 15 discovery violations, which were more significant in their magnitude, but many other violations, and I had already itemized 56 federal constitutional violations. And you may think that I'm just, some guy in a tinfoil hat, but I used to be a prosecutor, and I know the Constitution. I keep a copy close to my heart, and I have, except when taking a shower or sleeping, I have done so for, 42 years, 43 years. And it's my copy is signed by Clarence Thomas, which I treasure. And so anyway, I just filed that, and it will be posted soon. I told my webmaster to post it, but that was yesterday, and I don't know that he's gotten around to it. But at least you can see the September 7th filing, and don't watch it if you got a weak stomach. Don't read it if you've just eaten, because it really is shocking that this can happen in America. We see shocking things about what the FBI has done in the Clinton investigations and Trump investigations and so forth, and it's pretty clear that they're a bunch of crooks. And so I'm confident that I'm going to win if I can just get somebody who isn't a dyed-in-the-wool Bruce hater to read this habeas corpus petition. So anyway, I did nothing wrong. All I did was give my county commissioner's salary to charity for 3 years. The 3 years I was an elected county commissioner in El Paso County. The salary at the time was $63,000, so I gave my gross salary, not my after-tax salary, but my gross salary. That's $189,000. And the government prosecuted me and said, well, wait a minute, you have zero taxable income. I said, that's right, because I gave away all my salary. When you give away all of your income, you naturally have zero taxable income. And they said, well, we don't like the charity that you gave it to, etc., etc. So they prosecuted me. They called a witness at trial who said he was asked by the prosecutor, very foolishly, you never ask a question in front of a jury unless you know the answer, but this fellow had not been trained and groomed. So they asked this forensic accountant, assuming all of our charges against Mr. Bruce are correct, which they weren't, how much does he owe in taxes? And this accountant, who hadn't been programmed, took out his calculator and worked on it in front of the jury and said, $129. And the prosecutor was horrified, so he called another accountant in his office to repudiate his first accountant. But their theory was that I gave away $189,000 to charity in order to save $129 in state taxes. They didn't allow me, as you will see if you ever read the brief, they didn't allow me to subpoena witnesses, which is guaranteed in the 6th Amendment of the Constitution. They did not allow me to have a local jury trial. They didn't allow me time to get an attorney. It's a complete, utter railroad job. And I say this as a prosecutor. It was the worst criminal prosecution I've ever seen, and it was inflicted on me. And then, to cap it all off, just to make sure that they had covered all their bases, once all the evidence was over and the case was being submitted to the jury, they changed the jury instructions and said disregard what the indictment says, because they had a state grand jury indictment. Now the state had no, grand jury has no jurisdiction over me by law, but that didn't bother them. And they told the jury, call back. I'm sorry, I hadn't disconnected my landline. They told the jury You don't need to find that the crimes occurred in Denver, because there was no evidence that occurred in Denver. I did all my filings in El Paso County. But they said, just see if you can find that some crime occurred somewhere in Colorado, which meant that the Denver District Court had no jurisdiction over me, because there was no crime in Denver. And you can't change a grand jury indictment to match the evidence. You know, you just think about it. You can't do that. That's 4 of the dozens and dozens of outrageous things that they did. And I'm telling you that the people that did it are, the only reason I can't call them criminals is because they, the legislature writes the law, and they write the law so that nothing the government ever does is criminal. Even though it may be unconstitutional, they don't consider that to be criminal. So, anyway, so take a look at that. I just want to get that in there, but I'm not speaking to you in the purpose of having you feel sorry for me. You should feel not only sorry, but frightened of the state government that you have that is corrupt to the core, top to bottom. The judiciary, the prosecution, the witnesses, so forth. It was disgusting. Anyway, what I wanted to talk to you about today, and I cleared this with Ralph, is a petition that I'm aware of that is being promoted by 2 other people, and they are, one is a actual libertarian, registered libertarian. He's a member of the state libertarian board, and his name is Mike Spalding. And the other is a woman named Marty Nielsen, who's the president of the Colorado Union of Taxpayers. And I read online their proposal, and I want to have everybody in this room get motivated and excited about helping these people do it. Now, my first petition was in 1988 here in Colorado, and so that's 30 years since I started petitioning. I had 1 local success, Colorado Springs, and 1 state success with the state Tabor Amendment. And just last November, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the success of the Tabor Amendment. If you were here back in 1992, you'll know that the governor and every establishment figure said this was the end of the world. You know, if we passed tax limitation, if we gave ourselves the right to vote on taxes and debt and tried to put some reasonable limitation on the growth of government revenue, that it would be the end of the world. You know, Colorado would be closed for business. When the Pope came next year in 1993 for World Youth Day, there wouldn't be any police in Denver, and he would likely be assassinated. Actually said that. And on and on and on. So, as you can see, they were telling the truth about everything. But these people have, after 25 years after Tabor, because they are supporters of Tabor, they said we need to do something to correct these abuses that have crept in the last decade or more, because the government is just nakedly violating Tabor, state and local. This petition only deals with the state violations. But the website for that, which you should all write down and go home and study, that's your homework for today. The website is fairtax2018.com, FAIRTAX2018.com, C-O-M. And it's got a lot of information for you to try to motivate you to actually do something. It would be a waste of my time to just have however many people are in the room verbally support that. That doesn't mean anything. The 2 kinds of support that matter at this stage are, 1, money, whether it's $100, $500, $1,000, whatever you're excited to contribute, you're going to be getting back $500 or more as an individual filer, twice as much for a joint filer. every year forever. And that is simply to undo some of the abuses that have been caused by the state. And they get away with them because we have a totally corrupt judiciary. I know that from personal experience, not just in the tax case, but in many, many other cases. The only fairness I've ever received in Colorado courts is that when I evict a tenant for not paying his rent, they know that they have to allow me to evict the tenant. They can't force me. Sorry, I had the phone disconnected, I thought. So anyway, they have allowed me that victory to be able to get deadbeats out of my own apartment buildings. But in terms of Tabor violations, they have only one case where they ruled in favor of the voters, and 2 or 3 dozen where they ruled against the voters. Because you have to remember, which most people don't realize, judges are all government employees. They're all being paid by the taxpayers. And so they're slanted in terms of helping their masters, the people that pay their salary. I won't go into all the details why they did that, but the 5 largest violations are mentioned in this very short, simple petition that these people have written, and I support it. That's why I'm here today to speak about it. They're planning to start their petition drive next week, and they have 6 months, which sounds like a long time, but they have to get 150,000 signatures. Why? Because the government has a habit of throwing out, for ridiculous petty technicalities, a third of the signatures. The legal number they have to get is just under 100,000, 98,000 and something, but they won't, you can't just turn in that number of signatures because the government, which is always hostile to petitions, is going to throw out about a third. So you got to get 150 to end up with 100, and that's just the political reality at the moment. That's a very daunting task for a volunteer group, grassroots group. They realistically are going to need to pay people to collect signatures because it's a very tedious, boring process, and most people are not going to want to do it. You do the simple arithmetic, 150,000, if you had 500 people with petitions, each one would have to collect 300. And frankly, there aren't that many people who are that motivated about it. So the common way to motivate people to do something is to pay them. That's why we need to raise the money. It's going to take over $200,000 to pay the people, even if you pay $1.25 a signature. Obviously, we want as many volunteer signatures as possible, but realistically, if the choice is somebody giving 100 signatures as a volunteer or 1,000 signatures for pay, we need to cultivate those people that will get 1,000. Even if you get people who get 1,000, that's still 150 people, and it's very hard to find people that'll do that. That's why I'm trying to help these group of these people who want to try to reform the tax system to return to what Tabor promised. Because the government has manipulated the tax system, and they've engaged in many violations, and these are the 5 most prominent state violations. And they will be addressed and fixed and corrected. So if you support Tabor, you really don't have an excuse unless you're in a coma, in which case you aren't going to be in the room right now. You don't have an excuse for not helping. People can get, if they simply follow the instructions, they can get 16 signatures an hour. So at $1.25 payment, that's the equivalent of $20 an hour. And not being paid by the hour, they're being paid for their performance. You need to think about what you can do personally and the people you can help us hire by giving money so that we can pay them to stand out in front of the Walmart. 9 times out of 10 people will reject the petitioners. Now, I'm not asking you to do anything I haven't done myself. I've obtained personally over 10,000 signatures over the years. But I'm just asking people to go out and do what they can, and that is explained on the website. Now let me just mention, because obviously for you to be motivated to do it, you got to be sold and convinced that this is a great proposal. I'm just telling you, as the author of Tabor, that this is a great proposal. The government hates petitions. We have the most anti-petition state in Colorado, in the whole country. Colorado is the worst. You might find that hard to believe, but we've had more cases go to the U.S. Supreme Court than any other state in terms of the government attacking petitions. And the government always loses, but it's a very difficult process. If you recall back to the 2016 election, there was something on the ballot called Amendment 71. And the people promoting Amendment 71 are authoritarians who hate you, the rabble, which is what they call you. And that's why I consider it a matter of pride that they called me a rabble rouser, because I motivated you and your parents and other people, your neighbors, into action 3 times to finally get Tabor passed. Ironically, the chief proponent of Amendment 71, who was a spokesman you saw on TV, he was the Attorney General of Colorado at the time, and he's now the mayor of Colorado Springs. His name is John Suthers, a very, very, very evil man. And he was happy to put me in prison just to try to shut me up. Well, they obviously, you see that it worked, like all government programs. And he was the person who prosecuted me for the, I'm sorry.
Where's a gun?
Shoot it.
Sorry, I thought taking the phone off the hook would keep it from ringing, but apparently it doesn't. So now I've unplugged the phone. So Suthers is calling up.
Our treasurer,
to
Bill
explain.
Gibson, said, "Where's a gun when you need it?"
Oh, I can't have a gun. I'm on parole.
Oh my God.
Think about that. In fact, just to divert a little bit, not only am I not allowed for the rest of my life to own a firearm, despite the Second Amendment and the state constitution, I was deprived of my right to vote. I had a perfect voting record, 46 years of perfect attendance in voting, but I was not allowed to vote in 2016. They considered me dangerous because I had been convicted of what they call a felony, and what I called for giving away my money, and what I call felony philanthropy. Now you think about that concept. Going to prison because you gave your money to charity and took a government-encouraged tax deduction for doing so. Anyway, getting back to the proposal that I'm trying to motivate you to get involved for. 150,000 signatures. If we are lucky, we'll get a total of 500 petitioners, many of whom will only get 100 signatures if we're lucky. They have to average 300 signatures, so for everyone that only gets 100, somebody else needs to get 500 to get up to that total. So we need to have help in that proposal. Let me tell you why this proposal that Mr. Spaulding and Mrs. Nielsen have decided to be the proponents of, which you can find on the Secretary of State's website, why it's such a brilliant idea. The first thing is the way it's going to be sold, it's a 3-paragraph proposal. The point of selling it is not going to be cutting taxes. The point of selling it is simplification of the tax process. Right now, the state income tax return is 3 pages, 35 lines, supplemented by roughly 43 forms and schedules and other complication. And you'll see all this information on the website. And what their proposal does is it shrinks it down to a 4-line tax return. There's my fingers. Okay, there we are. 4 lines that you can fill out in 2 minutes. Now, you've heard for years people, even in the tax debate in Washington last year, talking about a form that you can fit on a postcard. That's what this is. We have a sample of the form that would be required to be used if and when this proposal gets on the ballot and is approved. I don't think, frankly, there's a lot of question about its being approved. The problem is getting it on the ballot. I think if people just understand, do you want to have a fairer, simpler tax return? Their answer is going to be yes, and no matter what the special interests say, they're going to say, well, yeah, I don't want to hire a CPA to fill out this form. I don't want to be threatened with jail if I don't do it correctly, and on and on. There's plenty of arguments, but a 4-line tax return is something that is a slam dunk winner if it just can get on the ballot. There's so many things that it does in terms of stripping down the system with all the closing of all the loopholes and so forth that, you know, I haven't written them down, but I can just recite some of them. Some of which I didn't know until this proposal came up. It has some parallels with what happened in Washington last month. We went in the national government from a worldwide jurisdiction to a territorial jurisdiction, so that you only pay income tax on the money that you earn in America. That was to try to encourage people to invest in America and repatriate, which is a fancy word for saying return money that they earned overseas. And they had to do that by offering them a lower tax rate. But in Colorado, we still have this crazy system where if your children earn money at summer camp in Montana, they owe Colorado income tax on that. In fact, not only do they owe on income earned elsewhere, they have what's called a use tax, and they have to pay Colorado tax on anything that they buy online, or if they're on a vacation in Florida and they buy a sun hat or t-shirt or something, Colorado expects to be paid for that. This proposal will eliminate that requirement, so that you only pay taxes on money earned in Colorado and spent in Colorado. And in fact, the use tax will be eliminated from the state tax return because it's an income tax return. Why are they charging you for a tax on retail sales in other states? It has nothing to do with income. So that'll just be eliminated altogether. They also have in Colorado, which is something that they have severely restricted in the federal proposal, an alternative minimum tax, which means if you're one of those evil rich people, you have to fill out your tax return twice and see which is the larger number, and you have to pay the larger number. There will be no alternative minimum tax in Colorado if this measure is approved. Has many other features that benefit taxpayers. Now, one of the things that they discovered, which I have tried to repeat or memorize, the Tabor Amendment, so I'm assuming everybody there supports the Tabor Amendment, because it's in the Constitution.
Is there anybody here who does not support the Tabor Amendment? Yeah, it is unanimous.
No, there's one.
Okay.
There's one?
Don't make me.
All right.
That's okay. No dessert for him. So, one of the things that the Tabor Amendment says, that I'm proud that I wrote it, it says in Section 8A that all state income will be taxed at one tax rate. We have a flat tax because we happen to have one established. It was a higher than flat tax than it should have been when it was established in 1992. But we don't want to have more demagoguery of soaking the rich and all this nonsense. And then the rich use it to create loopholes for themselves to escape the higher tax rate, and that's why we have a complicated tax system. The brilliance of this proposal examines through Department of Revenue reports that are made annually how much we have in income tax credits in Colorado. The Tabor Amendment says the only income tax credit you can have is if in the future people want to have a voter-approved tax credit. Voter-approved. And of course, what the legislature has done is not voter-approved. They gave special interest tax credits to a small percentage of the population. And that total cost by the end of this year will be approximately $360 million. You hear the politicians keep saying, oh, we need more money for roads, we need more money for health care, we need it for the children, blah, 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 blah. And yet they're giving $360 million in illegal tax credits, and that complicates the tax return. That's one of the reasons it's so long. And that is tax credits that they give. Now, you need to understand, a tax credit is not like a tax deduction. Deduction says there's certain income that you don't have to pay taxes on. But the tax credit says we're going to give you cash if you engage in certain behavior. That's one of the things that statists and authoritarians love to do about the tax system, is they want to engage in what's called behavior control. If you engage in this behavior, we're going to give you cash, tax money from other people. So the rest of us have to pay more in taxes because these other people are paying less. Well, that's not being taxed at one rate. There's one tax rate for the privileged special interest groups and another tax rate for the rest of us. 6 out of 7 people don't get an income tax credit. It's only a few that do, and some corporations. For example, there's one tax credit in 2015. There were 16 secret corporations. You can't know who they are because their tax return is confidential. But 16 corporations shared over $6 million in cash taken from everybody else's returns. And that works out to $380,000 per corporation. And what these people chose to do, which I think was inspired, was to say, instead of this handful of people getting tax credits, which are illegal in the first place, everybody else will get an equal amount of the total. The total is $360 million. There are roughly 3 million tax returns filed, so everybody gets $120. If you file a joint return, you get $240 taken off of your taxes. So you get a tax credit, which is legal because it is voter approved, and that doesn't cost the state anything, because the state no longer has to pay money to the special interest groups illegally. It has to give everybody the same. So everybody pays one rate and gets one tax credit. That's why we can afford to have a 4-line tax return. Now, apart from the illegal income tax credits, there are 4 other items listed in this proposal. And by the way, the proposal is 270 something words. It's not even a third of a page. And you can see the proposal at that website, fairtax2018.com. But there are 4 others that they, through research, seized upon to try to correct, to increase the size of the tax credit that everybody gets. And again, everybody gets the same. Whether you're a millionaire or a welfare mother, anybody who's a full-time Colorado adult resident gets this tax return. So there's no argument about sticking it to the rich or taking money back from the poor, blah, blah, blah. Everybody gets the same. People can understand that equal protection of the law is the American mantra, the American motto. The Supreme Court says on top of its pillars, equal justice under law, but they have never applied that to tax law. Well, these people think that it's time we do apply it and treat people equally in terms of tax law. And that has a lot of ramifications, all of which are good. You don't have to pay a CPA, you don't have to take a long time to file your return. When corporations pay the tax, you can't put a corporation in jail for tax evasion. Only people like me. And again, I didn't do any evasion at all, but corporations are treated differently than the rest of us because they don't risk going to jail. Right now, corporations don't pay, when they fill out the Colorado return, they don't pay on their out-of-state income, but you do. Your income worldwide is subject to Colorado income tax. That's not fair either. So there are 4 other violations of Tabor that they want to try to turn around into increasing the size of the income tax credit that everybody gets equally. Equality under the law. What a radical concept. The second one is something that I'm aware of that they, through research, figured out. In the late 1990s, we had a tobacco tax settlement. And that was a shakedown by the state of Colorado and other states to say to corporation, Big Tobacco, we're going to sue you and put you out of business because you're selling a dangerous product or unhealthy product or whatever. And so they were trying to shake down, which is called extortion in the law. Remember, you heard it from this former prosecutor. They told Big Tobacco, you're going to have to pay us big time, and we're going to basically put you out of business, unless you give us money every year forever. And the tobacco companies, to stay in business, had to agree to that. So they agreed to pay money in a settlement with various states, including Colorado, which has disgraced itself. And they said, okay, you're going to pay us a certain amount based upon the sale of tobacco every year. And that amount for the past almost 20 years has been close to $100 million a year. It's dipped down because of the slight decline in tobacco usage, but now it's at least 80 million or more every year. And that's revenue to the state. But the state didn't want to have that included in its Tabor refunds, didn't want to have it included in revenue, so it said this was a damage award, that the state had been damaged by teenagers who smoked behind the barn in Iowa. They smoked a cigarette, and the state of Colorado has been damaged, so that's why the state is getting the money. And if it's a damage award, it's not revenue, which is nonsense, totally dishonest. People in government, particularly lawyers, they lie every time they open their mouth. And I know that, that's why I jokingly call myself a recovering attorney. So they took this money, say 180 million a year, which fluctuates every year forever, and they said that's should not have ever been excluded from the revenue growth limit in Tabor, the spending limit. And so that will be included in the refund. So there's another, let's say if it's 3 million people sharing $81 million, that's another $27 per person, per filer. So that adds up to the 120 plus per individual. Then there's something, if you've been in here for 10 years, you may recall the scam about the car registration, where the government has abused the process and it's calling them fees instead of taxes, and saying, well, we can raise fees all we want. Well, frankly, fees when they're increased are part of the revenue limit anyway. But this proposal says any fee for car registration more than $10 per vehicle is going to be part of this tax credit. So that unravels and undoes this massive theft of tens of millions of dollars every year that's been going on for 9 years, and says that you're going to have $10 car registration, and if you have any more than that, it has to show up in this income tax credit. Then the next one, if I'm not putting you to sleep, has to do with enterprises. The government is calling everything an enterprise, which is not an enterprise, but they're lying, and they can get away with it because the Supreme Court will let them do whatever they want, because the Supreme Court, wants its next pay raise, and it wants to be in good terms with the politicians. So we had, for example, not only the enterprises for road and bridge repair, you may recall that the courts have upheld, and that's just it's not a business. It doesn't qualify as a Tabor enterprise, but they say it does. Just sheer defiance. And just this last May, there was something, if you were a real student of legislative scams, something called Senate Bill 267. And that said we're going to have a tax on sick people. I'm not making this up. We're going to have a tax on sick people and charge them money to go into a fund to promote socialized medicine. And Democrats think that that's just wonderful, because then they exclude all this revenue from the Tabor limit, because they say it's a fee for an enterprise, and an enterprise is supposedly a government-owned business. It isn't included in state revenue. But that was a $600 million increase, not subject to the revenue limit. Just totally dishonest. I mean, these people lie, cheat, and steal every waking hour. And so that's included in this revenue limit. Now the state, the state can get around that by simply not calling it an enterprise anymore, having it be part of the revenue limit. And then it has to meet the revenue growth limit, and obviously you can't have the revenue grow 600 million a year. That's more than inflation and population combined. So it'll be taken care of that way. But you can still have this program. We're not against helping sick people, but it's the sick people who are paying the tax. The hospital charges for every sick patient that it has in its hospital. It gives the money to the government to be redistributed. And what is redistribution of the wealth but the cornerstone of the Communist Manifesto? The last item, you may recall if you've been here a dozen years, called Referendum C, where the legislature came up with a con job of saying, well, we're going to have a 5-year timeout from obeying the Constitution. Now you think about that concept. How would you feel about a 5-year timeout on obeying the First Amendment? How would you like to have a 5-year timeout on your right to a jury trial? Any other constitutional provision? You can't change the Constitution by a statute. If you don't know that, you need to learn it quickly, because that's what they did. But they said, don't worry, it's only for 5 years, a 5-year timeout. Well, that was in 2005 for the following 5 years, which is 2006 through 2010. But they never stopped stealing our excess revenue refunds. They have continued them every year forever. And there's a state study that shows that the excess revenue is that they've kept over the years, in 13 years basically, 12 years so far, is $18 billion. $1.5 billion a year that you could have shared with your fellow citizens. But they basically repealed the spending limit by a statute. You can't do that. It's illegal. So rather than arguing about, fighting that in court, which you won't get anywhere on because of the state Supreme Court being in the bag, then this proposal says that roughly $1 billion a year will be part of the refund. Now, if it's $1.2 billion a year, just to pick a number, for 3 million tax filers, that's $400 per individual, $800 on a joint return that you will get every year until they finally honestly do what they promised to do, which is to repeal Referendum C and say that these 5 years are up, or they were up, in 2010, and stop trying to steal our refunds. And then we go back to having the Tabor revenue growth limit, and that's the only major control that we have on state government, is if government can take all of our money without our permission, you're not free. So you need to have the spending limit restored and not have the government lie to people, which they do, as I said, 24/7. So you add these things up and you're talking about between $500 and $1,000 per person, per filer per year, double for a joint return. So there's a good financial incentive. I suspect that this group that I'm talking to now, even though you'd like to have the money, understands that the real issue is not the money, but the growth of government. That's what you do when you take away our money and spend it on expanding the bureaucracies. You grow government. And the definition of freedom, the only one that I've ever been satisfied with, is freedom means limited government. That's why the Bill of Rights says the word no and not 24 times in the first 10 amendments. Congress shall make no law. Does that sound like a limit on government? Of course. So there's plenty of philosophical reasons. There's good financial reasons to do it. And keep in mind, those people that want to do this, even if they're mercenary and they only are interested in the money for themselves, they can get paid for getting this petition that will end up giving them $500 or $1,000 a year forever. So anyway, I want to leave some time for questions. I don't want to take up your whole afternoon, but I enthusiastically support the proposal, and I urge you to get involved. So Ralph said that I could just meander on, but I think it's time to stop and see if there are any questions. Thank you for listening.
Let me jump in here, Doug, and say that in 10 minutes I need to stop the recording for about a minute and then return to the recording because of technical limitations. I have a list of questions. Does anybody else have a list of questions or comments for Mr. Bruce? We have that gentleman in the at the very end.
Me too.
Okay, so I forgot your name again.
Steve Kowalski.
Yeah, Steve Kowalski, and then Mike. Anybody else?
Yes, me.
Okay, Steve, Mike, Larry. Anybody else? Then Ralph. Let me swing the camera over to Steve so that Doug can see you.
And by the way, in terms of seeing people, I don't have a lot of experience with Skype, but I'm sitting here looking down at my photo. I could be looking up at the camera, but I just would rather look at the audience in the background. So understand that you don't have eye contact with me. It's not because I have bad manners. It's just because Skype sort of, unless you want to look straight into the camera the way you do when you're on TV.
Doug, do you see
concentrating on this thing.
do you see Steve on your screen?
No, actually, I see this video. I see the person, the waiter that just took something away. There's a woman to the right of my screen who's got her left hand up on her chin, and she's wearing a blue sweater. She just moved her hand. So that's, I can't see. The rest of it is on the Skype instructions panel. So
Okay,
that's all right.
well, Steve, wave your hand, and Doug, do you see the gentleman waving his hand?
Actually, I can't, but that's all right.
Okay, well, it's on the screen. So, Steve, go ahead.
Yes,
You got the microphone. Great, thank you.
yes, I really appreciate all you've done over the years, Doug, and I too have been following taxes quite a bit. I know you're fighting it from the bottom up. However, I've discovered a person that has written a book. It's called From Sovereign to Serf. His name is Roger Sales, and he has exited the tax system from the top down. Again, the name of this book is From Sovereign to Serf, and the subtitle is Government by the Treachery and Deception of Words. How we have been deceived over the years, and how you can get out of the system by filing an affidavit that allows you to reclaim your status not as a U.S. citizen, but a citizen of the United States of America.
Okay, well, you're breaking up a little bit, and I haven't heard a question yet.
Just a comment. I recommend you to look into this for a different approach to taxation.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in here for a second. Doug, could you give us a brief overview of what Jeff Wright has gone through and what his status is today?
Well, Jeff Wright, a friend of mine who now lives in another state, was hounded, harassed because of his association with Maine. I regret that, but I can't do anything more than I am doing about corrupt government. He was very helpful when he was here in the campaign, and but he's now out of state, and I don't know what else I have to say about him. He's a good man, a patriot. That's the highest compliment that I can give anybody.
The reason I asked about Jeff, because Jeff spent full time and a lot of time and effort trying to get out of the tax system. Do you know what the final resolution of that was?
Well, I don't want to talk about anybody else's relationship with the IRS. I don't
Okay,
think that's
then I'll shut
proper.
up. We have Mike.
But by the way, and to follow up on that though, people need to understand that when I went to prison, it was on state income tax charges. State. The IRS audited me and said I owed nothing, zero, no fraud. There's nothing wrong with my tax return. It was totally correct, and the state went after me for obvious political reasons. I tried to have the IRS auditors testify at my trial, but one of the many, many abuses in my case was they would not allow me to subpoena witnesses, even though that's guaranteed in the Constitution. They wouldn't allow me to subpoena witnesses, and when I tried to introduce the audit that said I owed nothing, they would not allow that audit to be presented to the jury. So the IRS, I have no problems with the IRS. I mean, personally, I am a fan of what's called the fair tax. If we could get rid of the 16th Amendment and have no federal income tax, to just have a sales tax, that frankly the rate couldn't be increased. We don't have any truly national elections now, but the sales tax, which is a little bit more voluntary than the income tax and less intrusive, is a better solution. So I don't blame the IRS for that. They're just following orders as the mentality goes in government.
Okay, Mike's, you're up.
Yeah, Doug, the setup to my question is a little bit complicated. Let me see if I can get this down right.
You have to speak louder.
Okay, how's this? Does this work?
Not much.
No, the problem, Mike, is that you have to. Why don't you come up here and use this microphone? Both microphones are being recorded, but Doug is only hearing from that microphone.
I see. Okay. Okay, does this help?
Yes.
Okay. The setup to my question is a bit complicated, so let me see if I can get this down right.
I'm going to ask the question first, and then I'll decide if it needs amplification.
Okay. I have had my own run-in after half a century of staying out of trouble with the federal government, and I think overbearing and being abusive. And my question was what kind of perspective I should take from that, especially in light of the fact I now also have a felony conviction for a totally victimless crime. And that affects my credibility as well as my ability for employment and such. So anyway, that is my question. May I do a little bit of a setup?
I don't understand the question. You're saying you had a victimless crime where you got a felony conviction, which I can identify with.
Exactly.
I'm still trying to fight mine. But I will say something related, which is that this proposal that I'm urging you and everybody else in the room to take a petition for, or 2 petitions, or 3, this will be a model for the country. We have 40 states, roughly, that have income tax systems. And this can be, even though you take out the references to Tabor violations, the principle of having one flat rate and a 4-line tax return and everybody getting a flat income tax credit, that can be translated to every other state. So just as Tabor could be a model for other states, and people have tried, although without sufficient persistence, to adopt it to other states, the same thing is true for this idea of having a 4-line tax return, because other states have the same kind of problem. Now, as far as the federal system, I just told you that the federal government was being honest and helpful to me. If you had a problem with the IRS, I don't know what I'm supposed to say about that. I don't know anything about the merits of your case. But I'm talking about trying to fix the tax system in Colorado. People need to focus. Okay? I've been here 31 and a half years, and I've focused on the four corners of Colorado. I consider the federal government to be a lost cause. And any group that can print money, calling it Federal Reserve notes, and say that it's legal tender, and that you can't require the use of gold in any private contracts that you engage in, and various other things, and it has dozens and dozens of illegal programs. I mean, 3/4 of the spending of the federal government is not authorized by the Constitution. And so, to me, that's a lost cause. That's like spitting in the wind. I think I took on a monumental task just to try to deal with the state of Colorado, state and local government in Colorado, in the area of revenue and taxes. Government, I have concluded, has three great powers: the power to legislate, the power to confiscate, and the power to incarcerate. And they've applied all three to me. And they can do it to other people. So I think we need to focus not necessarily on your own parochial neighborhood, but I'm trying to get something done to benefit the 5.5 million people of Colorado. And I can't deal with shenanigans going on in the IRS about people that have conservative Tea Party groups and can't get a tax-exempt status or whatever. I mean, government is so big and so intrusive, people need to set priorities and focus on something, and I'm giving them something that they can focus on right now for a petition drive that starts next week. You can read the text, you can read the explanation, you can look at the sample tax return that would be developed, and you ought to get excited about it. And that way you can focus on something. I'm putting it in your lap, so you ought to deal with that. But as far as people's problems with the IRS or other agencies, I tried to exploit Clive and Bundy's court case because he won his court case, and I tried to point out that what the state of Colorado did to me was 10 times worse than what they did to Clive and Bundy. So, you got to pick a target and focus on it. If you're against everything that every level of government is doing, you're not going to be effective.
Yes, I do agree in the importance of picking your battles very carefully. So let me focus my question a little bit as follows.
Wait a minute. Is this the same person that...
Yes.
Well, okay, I want to make sure, Ralph, everybody gets... If there are other people that have questions, I think he's... he had his chance to focus his question.
Okay, Mike, do you mind?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Our next questioner is Larry. And Larry, I think you were pointing at Linda. Is that correct?
I just wanted to make sure that Linda was on your list.
Okay, so Linda will be after me. Anybody else wish to speak? Okay, so Larry, let me swing the camera around to you. And actually, you're on camera right now, Larry.
In that case, I'll sit down. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Larry Sarner is the name. You may recall
hello,
it.
Larry. Can I take 10 seconds to tell a joke that I share with Larry?
Sure.
We both, many years ago, decades ago, in fact, had we both had an addiction or a history of having gone and read Mad Magazine. And Larry Sarner had something, you may not remember it, but I was making a joke, making a reference to a cartoon in Mad Magazine about calling witnesses and saying that the first witness in the baseball stadium would be Adam A. Aardvark.
Anthony A. Aardvark, yeah.
Anthony Aardvark, whatever. Okay. So, and he remembered that. So you can see that he's a student of trivia, like me.
Yes, the prosecution was going to take on Perry Mason to prove that he had actually committed the murder in Yankee Stadium in front of 50,000 witnesses, and they were going to call every one of them alphabetically.
Right. I'm counting on Larry Sarna to help us in, where is it, Longmont?
Loveland.
Somewhere, Loveland? Okay. Go ahead.
Well, I've got in fact, Loveland is part of that. I've got actually 3 questions involved here. Let me start. You were attacking a number of issues through the income tax, as I best can detect it here.
I think the proponents are attacking it. I was describing.
Okay. All right. Yes. Okay. The proposal is. I'm sure I know you're familiar with the term debrucing, especially on the local level, but it's also occurred at the state level.
I'm the only person I know of whose name is not only an epithet but an eponym.
Indeed. Does this in any way address debrucing?
No. No, what it does is it says that the state revenue growth limit at the state only, not local, but the state only.
Okay.
Remember, you got to have a single subject in a proposal. The single subject here is the income tax. And so this does not deal with local government. It doesn't deal with other problems. It doesn't deal with the abuse of government going into debt without voter approval, which is another Tabor violation. It only has to do with correcting these state-level abuses to have a simplified tax return where everybody gets the same tax rate and the same tax credit.
Okay. In circulating this, the circulation of constitutional amendments and
this is a statute.
This is a statute?
Yes.
Ah,
Now, it's a
okay.
statute because we have, I told you briefly about Amendment 71, which has outrageous, unconstitutional prohibition on, and I told you how the state government hates petitions. Right now, you won't see any constitutional amendments in your lifetime until Amendment 71 is stricken by the federal courts. So this is a statute which we're allowed to do without the restrictions that were imposed on constitutional amendments.
Well, that actually clarifies or disposes of my question because Amendment 71. I think most people here know its provisions, but it does say for constitutional amendments that you now have to be able to collect a minimum number in every state senatorial district, which is
Right.
an almost impossibility to achieve.
It's not almost, it is. I consider myself Mr. Petition, having put more things on the ballot, state and local, than anybody else ever since statehood. And it was done, and it's vicious, sadistic. It shows total contempt for the electorate. And remember, the person who was the spokesman on TV was John Suthers, the man who prosecuted me.
It also was being backed by the
Big Oil.
Big Oil, yes, and that was very unfortunate. So that brings me to my big question then, which is about actual enforcement of this. That it's a statute makes for some interesting questions about the legislature going in and changing it.
Okay.
At least Tabor requires that if they change it and increase revenue, then they have to actually come to the voters for it. But many of the things that you talked about, you pointed out that the Supreme Court has undermined Tabor in such a
I
way
get
to
the
permit
drift.
these things. Sorry?
I get the drift. I can answer
Okay.
the question.
All right, go ahead.
I'm going to
This
stop.
propo-
Doug, just 1 second. I need to stop this recording for 30 seconds so that the file size doesn't grow too large. So let me stop the recording, and then I will start it again in about 30 seconds. And we're back. So Doug, please answer Larry's question.
The Tabor Amendment, which is a constitutional amendment, says in section 4A the kinds of tax changes that require voter approval in advance. One is a new tax rate increase, mill levy, that's property tax, above that for the prior year, or a change in tax policy directly causing a net gain in tax revenue. So if they change the tax policy of the income tax law that we would be approving, that requires voter approval in advance. Okay? That's right there, black and white, it's ironclad. I wouldn't be urging you to get involved in something that our corrupt Supreme Court can just blow off in a minute. Now, there's nothing you can do about people nakedly violating the law, but the point is, it's there to say that if you take away the flat rate income tax credit for everybody, that's a tax increase. So that requires voter approval in advance. And if people know that they were going to be getting $500 or $700 a year, and now they're getting nothing, I think the Supreme Court would be very wise to reconsider so that they save their own necks, literally.
Literally?
Literally. I know it's inconceivable to most people, but my favorite president, Thomas Jefferson, said every few generations we have to refertilize the tree of liberty with the manure of patriot blood. People have become complacent now. I'm not here advocating violence, but I'm just pointing out I'm trying to do something peaceful. I don't think that the legislature is going to dare to do something to just blow this off and just say, well, this voter-approved petition is repealed. They could do that if it were a petition on some other subject, but not if it's on taxes, because of the language in Tabor. I anticipated that by putting that language in Tabor in 1992. Okay?
Okay, Larry, I'm next. Oh, how wonderful. Swing this camera around. Doug, in terms of Amendment 71, and you said the federal courts can overturn Amendment 71, could you please explain the legal reasoning behind that?
Well, it's very simple. The federal courts, Colorado is the most anti-petition state in the country. That's indisputable. It's had the most number of cases overturned by the federal courts, not the U.S. Supreme Court, but the 10th Circuit, and even the federal district court in Colorado, because the federal judges understand the meaning of the right to petition and freedom of speech. And there's a long history of cases that the state tried to say that you had to be a registered voter to carry a petition. That was struck down. They said that you couldn't pay people except on the formula set by the legislature, which was deadly. That was stricken. Things trying to restrict the pool of who could carry a petition, those were stricken. I'm not going to go into a seminar on just naming those cases, but I'm well familiar with them. And there is a case filed already against Amendment 71 by an attorney. I don't agree with his politics, but I agree with his objective, which is to strike Amendment 71 in federal court. That's the only way it can be stricken. The fascists and statists and authoritarians in the Colorado judiciary are never going to do it. That's why it has to be heard in federal court, where it's been successful almost every time it's been tried. And so there's a case at the trial level. It was filed last April. And I think it's unfortunate that the attorney has given the federal judge so much leeway. The state filed a motion to dismiss, which is the government always does, to try to see if they can buy off the judge. And that's been sitting there since June, and here it is January, and the judge hasn't gotten off of his robes to make a ruling. And no matter what ruling the judge makes, it's probably going to be appealed by the other side, the losing side. So you can expect that we will not have a petitioned constitutional amendment in the 2018 election, because they've been dawdling for so long that even if they made a ruling next month, we aren't even at the stage of having the plaintiff try to get a judgment in favor of the citizens' right to petition the government. I mean, this is such a slam dunk case. If you recall, they made no bones about what they were trying to do in passing Amendment 71. They said the goal was to make it harder to amend the Constitution by petition. They didn't make it harder to amend the Constitution by referrals from the politicians, so it wasn't a question of reducing the volume. It was only a question of attacking the source, which was the citizens' right to petition. And the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary takes that very seriously.
Okay. Our next speaker is Linda.
Hello. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Tabor Amendment is frequently on my mind, living in Loveland, Colorado, where it's usually ignored. I have a comment. Over several years ago, Governor Hickenlooper was organizing various meetings around the state, supposedly with influence makers. You had to write up a CV and you were vetted to attend this event. I got to attend the one up in Larimer County, and we were supposed to, give opinions. He was supposed to listen to opinions of the locals. And I was absolutely flabbergasted at how little time people were actually allowed to talk. We were manipulated by making little word clouds and answering some questions electronically. But the whole thing was geared to saying the state could have all these wonderful things, cure all its problems, if only we would get rid of that evil Tabor Act.
Right.
I was fuming by the end of that session. A couple years later, Colorado DHS went around the state asking people for their input, and by golly, it was the same exact thing repeated again. We could have all these wonderful things for children if only we'd get rid of that evil Tabor Act. I almost think this was a misuse of funds for DHS to go around and actually spread this political message rather than actually dealing with its own particular business.
And your question is?
My question is, how do citizens challenge these violations of Tabor when we can't get lawyers to help us?
You don't need a lawyer. You're a free-born citizen, American. I've made the joke about calling myself a recovering attorney. You don't have to be a lawyer to petition the government. You don't have to be a lawyer to get politically organized. When you say, how can you do it? I've spent the past hour plus showing you a roadmap of how to do it in a very concrete way that's going to be popular, so that even the people that don't really care about the size of government, they will care about the fact that they can have a 4-line tax return that they can fill out in 2 minutes, and that they're going to get the money that right now is being shifted to special interest groups and secret corporations. That's how you do it. How you do it is go to the website, fairtax2018.com, click the volunteer button, collect signatures. It's no fun. It's no fun, but it's boring. But that's the only way you can get something
I've
on the
done
ballot. You can't stop collectivists from getting together and having meetings. They tried that 2 different election cycles, trying to see if they could get enough Tabor haters together to build an organization, and they failed both times, by the way. No matter how much publicity they got about how the public consensus was Tabor was terrible and blah, blah, blah. It's been 25 years that they've been saying that. I mean, it's a broken record. They aren't going to do it, but what they did, in effect, was to prevent another Tabor at the constitutional level by tricking 56% of the voters into voting to give up their right to petition the government. So I'm trying to use the window that remains, which is a statutory petition, and people can say what if, but if we pass that, we're going to get real money, we're going to get real reform, we're going to get a real change in the income tax return, be a model for the country, and it's a no-lose situation, but it involves you're caring enough to actually do something rather than simply complain. That's what the people who are proposing those meetings did. They were trying to foment imaginary anger or frustration with Tabor, and the frustration with Tabor is only among the people who are trying to spend other people's money. Remember, it's the taxpayers' Bill of Rights. So, how can you do something about it? Get involved. I'm giving you something you can do. Whether you want to give any money or not, that's up to you. But you can spend your time collecting signatures to put it on the ballot. It's a concrete proposal with a concrete objective, and I'm telling you, it'll do almost as much good as the Tabor Amendment did, but only, again, restricted to the state government. If you can save $1 billion a year in taxes to be given to the taxpayers instead of to be given to the tax eaters, I consider that worth doing.
Okay, Linda, would you hand me the microphone?
Or Larry. Thank you.
Doug, I have 2 questions. I only want you to answer one because people are leaving. Whichever one you want to answer, please explain what a secret corporation is, or please tell us why there were no witnesses allowed in your trial. What fig leaf did they use to say you're not?
I didn't say there were no witnesses. I never said that.
No, why didn't they allow you to call?
I didn't say that. I speak very precisely.
Okay.
I will answer both questions.
All right.
The first question again is, repeat it.
Secret corporations.
Okay. People don't get a right to see other people's tax returns. Okay? So the state lists a summary on its annual report, Department of Revenue annual report for 2015, 2016. You can look at it, and you look under income tax credits. They got one page for individuals and one page for corporations. On the corporation page, they list 16 corporations, unnamed. That makes them secret. You can't find out the name because they say people are privileged to not disclose, their corporate tax return. And they're getting, among them, $6 million just in that one tax credit. And there are dozens of tax credits. So that's what a secret corporation is. You don't know the names of the corporations that are getting money that causes you to have to end up paying more because they're paying less. Now, the second question is,
What legal reasoning did the judge use to deny you your right to call witnesses?
A crook doesn't need any legal reasoning at all. Got that? A crook doesn't need any legal. We have a corrupt judiciary. Now, I didn't say I wasn't allowed to call any witnesses. I called a couple of voluntary witnesses, but I was denied my right to subpoena witnesses. That's the word that I used. I couldn't subpoena the IRS agents, for example, the critical witnesses who would prove my innocence. It's not my job at a trial to prove my innocence, but I was able to prove my witnesses because they audited my tax return in question and said it was a perfectly valid tax deduction. But they wouldn't allow me to subpoena those people to bring them to court in Denver, which the trial was not supposed to be at in the first place because the Sixth Amendment says you have a right to a local jury trial, local. And they wouldn't give me that right to a local trial. So
did the judge give any reason whatsoever as to
why? The judge is a crook.
I understand, but did he give you any reason? If he gave you no reason, then that's the answer.
He was a she.
Okay.
And she retired shortly after my case was over, after she'd done her job, for the establishment. There is no reason. When I filed motions, written motions to subpoena witnesses, they're written motions, and they never ruled on them. They just ignored them. So the judge feels I'm the judge, I don't have to explain anything.
That's the answer I was looking for. They ignored you.
However, if you really want to get into the weeds on it, the state has a court rule, and all these court rules are illegal because legislation is supposed to be by the legislature. We all taught that in 5th grade. But the courts make up their own rules, okay, which is illegal, a violation of the state constitution, the federal constitution, and so forth. So the state has a court rule, Criminal Procedure Rule 17B, B as in bankruptcy, B as in Bruce. And what that says is that if you don't have an attorney and you're a defendant, then the government does not have to allow you to subpoena witnesses. You got that? Patently unconstitutional. They created the fact that I couldn't have an attorney because they wouldn't give me time to get an attorney because she's a crook. So I wasn't given right on July 11th, 2011. I asked for time to get an attorney and they said no. And then, by the way, the tape stopped recording.
Speaking of tape stopping recording, given your last statement about she's a crook, do you have any objection to me posting this on YouTube? If you do, I will not do so.
I have no objection. She knows she's a crook.
Okay.
She's a public figure. And a public figure, I'm familiar with the rules of libel, and truth is an absolute defense.
And one of our attendees asked, who is she?
Her name was Ann Mansfield. She has since retired.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, in Douglas Bruce, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for spending all those hours with me and Fred trying to get this Skype call set up. It was a miracle that we got it to work, but thank you so much. I think Douglas is deserving of a huge round of applause of those people who are still here. Thank you, Douglas.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. I expect Larry Sarner to be going to the website and pushing the volunteer button.
Okay.
I hear you.
And with that, I'm going to turn off the recording. And Douglas, to the best of luck to you. Thank you for all you've done for this state. My God, we owe you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Go to the
Bye.
website.